A lecture hall froze the moment Professor Allen slammed Deshawn's exam receipt onto the desk and said, "Students like you don't earn seats here. You slip through cracks." Eyes turned. No one spoke. Deshawn stood there, humiliation burning through him, as the professor reached for campus security. But before they arrived, Deshawn pulled out something that made Allen's smug smile vanish fast. What he revealed next would flip the entire university upside down. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The lecture hall was packed wall to wall, the kind of claustrophobic academic auditorium where ideas were supposed to take flight. But on that cold Monday morning, something else filled the air. The faint buzz of fluorescent lights hung above rows of steel chairs as a sea of students hunched over laptops and scribbled notes, waiting for the voice of authority to begin the session. Professor Benjamin Allen, polished and proud, stepped to the podium like he was stepping onto a Broadway stage. His neatly pressed beige blazer matched the condescension in his smile. Known for his ruthless grading and razor-sharp sarcasm, Allen had earned respect through fear and elitism. In the fourth row, Deshawn Miller sat still, a black spiral notebook balanced on his lap, his pen quietly moving across the margin. He wasn't invisible. He was the only black student in a sea of white and privileged faces. But for months he'd mastered how to shrink himself, to nod without drawing attention, to speak only when necessary. Today, though, he had no choice but to raise his hand. The syllabus had changed. The mid-semester exam now carried a $320 registration fee, something not mentioned before. It was a significant amount for anyone without a trust fund, but for Deshawn it was impossible without sacrificing meals. So he asked, "Excuse me, Professor Allen," Deshawn said, voice calm, respectful. "About the exam fee. Will there be any alternative options for students who may not be able to afford it up front?" For a second the professor just stared. Then came a chuckle. Low, sharp, cruel, like a blade being drawn. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice cutting through the lecture hall. "I wasn't aware the university had a charity wing sponsoring underperformers." The room froze. A few students smirked. One girl's gasp broke the silence like glass cracking. Deshawn blinked, stunned, as the professor continued, undeterred. "If you're already asking about money, I suggest you reconsider this course. Perhaps something less demanding. Within budget." Deshawn felt every eye turn to him. He wasn't a student anymore. He was a spectacle. The air got heavier. His throat burned. But not from shame, from fury he dared not show. He nodded once, slow and controlled, then looked down at his notebook, pretending to scribble as the professor resumed his lecture like nothing had happened. But something had. Something irreversible. Deshawn didn't hear the rest of the lecture. He heard only the professor's voice echoing in his mind. "You don't belong here." That line lodged itself deep, twisting like a thorn in his chest. He wasn't poor because he was lazy. He'd worked harder than anyone else in that room. He wasn't stupid. His GPA proved otherwise. But he was black and broke, and that combination made him disposable in spaces like this. The humiliation didn't end when class did. In the hallway, whispers trailed behind him. He heard snatches of conversation. "Isn't he on a scholarship? Why would you take a class you can't afford? He probably thinks financial aid covers everything." Each word scraped another layer off his confidence. He walked to the library, sat at a far back corner, and stared at the screen in front of him. His mind was racing. He should have stayed silent. He should have just borrowed the money somehow. But even as that thought crossed his mind, another pushed harder. Why should he stay silent to make them comfortable? Why was the price of being black in academia always silence? He stared at the blinking cursor on his screen, a blank page. Then, without knowing what moved him, he opened a new document and titled it, "The Price of Belonging." It was supposed to be a journal entry, a way to let the rage bleed somewhere private. But the more he typed, the more the shame transformed into fire. He wrote everything: the insult, the way Allen laughed, the stares, the way his voice cracked when he tried to ask a valid question. He wrote it raw, without polishing, without filtering. When he stopped, it was 3,000 words of pain and protest. He hit save. Then he sat back, staring at the glow of the monitor, fists clenched. That was the moment something inside him shifted. Deshawn wasn't going to drop the class. He wasn't going to bow out quietly. He was going to stay, ace that exam, and make sure the same humiliation never happened to another black student again. What came next, though, even he didn't see coming. He closed his laptop and sent a single text to his best friend Marcus. "Meet me at the library. Bring your camera." The vow had been made, but what Deshaun was about to set in motion would ripple far beyond the walls of that lecture hall. And not even Marcus was ready for what his friend had planned. The coldness of Professor Allen's insult still simmered under Deshaun's skin as he left the library that day. But it wasn't a new wound. It was merely a reopening of an old unhealed scar. That moment in the lecture hall hadn't created the storm inside him. It had only given it a name, because long before he was shamed in front of future CEOs and political science majors, Deshaun Miller had already fought battles few of them could even imagine. His story didn't begin on a university campus. It began under a leaky roof in the backstreets of Baton Rouge, where resilience was inherited like a birthmark, and survival was a subject taught long before the first day of school. He was 6 when the first eviction notice came. An official-looking paper slapped onto the apartment door with tape that peeled the paint when his mother tried to remove it. "We just gotta move again," she said, brushing his hair with shaking fingers. "New place, new adventure, baby." But there was no adventure, only a drafty corner of her cousin's one-bedroom house, where Deshaun learned to share space with 3 cousins, a broken heater, and the ache of watching his mother pretend everything was okay. She worked 3 jobs, none of them consistent. Some nights she was a janitor at the mall, others she folded uniforms in the back room of a laundromat, humming gospel songs to stay awake. Deshaun learned early that asking for things, birthday parties, new sneakers, even permission slips, only made her eyes fill with guilt. So he stopped asking. When other kids circled toys in catalogs, he circled canned goods in grocery store flyers, and daydreamed of meals that filled the whole plate. He became good at invisibility. At school, he sat at the edge of every group project, carried an old composition book with duct-taped corners, and counted the minutes between lunch and dismissal like a countdown to silence. But inside that silence, something grew. An obsession with words, numbers, patterns. He wasn't the loudest in class, but he was always watching, always calculating. In the 5th grade, a substitute teacher left behind a standardized test review sheet. While other students doodled in the margins, Deshaun copied the questions and worked through them that night, by the light of the flickering street lamp outside his window. That was the first time he realized intelligence wasn't owned by the rich. It lived in whoever fed it. Middle school only deepened that hunger. When other kids mocked him for wearing shoes with the sole peeling, he read during recess. When a teacher falsely accused him of stealing headphones because he looked the type, he stared back with a fury that burned, refusing to cry. He didn't have the language then to name the injustice. But he felt it how quickly adults assumed guilt when skin was dark and clothes were worn. His mother Deborah never sugarcoated the world. "You're gonna have to be 10 times better just to be seen as equal," she said one night after a white security guard followed him around a dollar store. "That ain't fair. But that's what it is. So decide, do you want to let that break you? Or do you want to make them choke on your success?" He chose the latter. And every year he sharpened himself like a weapon made of books, debate competitions, and late-night study sessions. By the time high school rolled around, he was juggling AP classes with part-time work at a gas station, often doing homework between shifts, and nodding off during bus rides. He had no prom tuxedo, no senior trip photos, but his transcript glowed with awards. Still, no matter how perfect his essays or how high his SAT score climbed, something always reminded him he didn't quite belong. When college application season came, his guidance counselor raised her brows skeptically. "Maybe aim for a state school," she'd suggested, her voice gentle, condescending. "With your background, those elite places might not be realistic." Deshaun didn't answer. He just folded his acceptance letter to the prestigious Northbrook University and slipped it into his back pocket like a weapon he'd been saving. Even getting there hadn't been easy. His financial aid package barely covered tuition, and every semester brought a new scramble. Books too expensive, housing always on the edge of collapse. He took work-study jobs, tutored freshmen, skipped meals, lied to his mom about how well things were going. And through it all, he carried that silent fear that one small misstep could send it all crashing down. So when Professor Allen laughed at his question about the exam fee, it wasn't just about money. It was about every grown-up who had ever looked at him and seen someone who didn't belong. Every administrator who assumed he was lucky to be there. Every peer who never asked his name but assumed his story. That laugh was a knife. But Deshaun had been bleeding his whole life. That evening, Marcus arrived at the library with the camera like Deshaun had asked. But instead of a vlog or social rant, Deshaun asked for something else. A silent close-up shot of him writing, just his hand and the sound of his pen against paper. No music, no dialogue, just 30 seconds. He uploaded the video to a blank social media account with the caption, "They laughed at my wallet. They won't laugh at my will." He didn't expect anything from it. But the next morning, he woke up to over 10,000 views. And in his inbox, buried under spam and reminders, was an email from an unfamiliar sender with the subject line, "Private Scholarship Invitation, Immediate Action Required." The message inside was brief, the tone formal, yet oddly personal. It congratulated him on his academic perseverance and offered a full-ride scholarship. No application, no essay, no strings, or so it seemed. The organization was anonymous. The sender had no name, just a logo he didn't recognize, and the offer came with a deadline. Respond within 72 hours or the opportunity is forfeited. Deshaun stared at the screen, heart thudding. Was this divine timing, or something more dangerous? Because in a world that had always made him earn every scrap, something about getting help without begging felt off. He clicked reply, but instead of typing, his fingers hovered over the keyboard, frozen. Was this finally the break he deserved, or was he stepping into a trap he couldn't afford to escape? The email offering the scholarship sat open on Deshaun's laptop screen, its cold professionalism disguising the heavy implications beneath. He read it again and again, hoping the tone would shift with each reread, hoping that somewhere between the lines there would be a hint of warmth, of sincerity, of genuine support. But there wasn't. Just perfect grammar, vague congratulations, and that same sterile signature line, Northbrook University Office of Diversity and Inclusive Excellence. Even the word inclusive felt hollow in that context, more like a branding exercise than a belief system. Still, he accepted it. How could he not? The numbers alone made the decision impossible to ignore. Tuition covered in full, meal plan extended, housing guaranteed. It sounded like freedom. But Deshaun would soon learn it was anything but. The moment he signed the agreement, invisible strings began to tighten around him. It wasn't a scholarship. It was a silent contract of obedience. In his first semester under the scholarship, Deshaun walked the campus differently. He noticed how staff greeted him with forced smiles, how classmates spoke to him in careful, measured tones, as if he were a delicate experiment on the verge of failure. One student, Chad from New Hampshire, who sat 2 rows behind him in political philosophy, openly joked during a group study session, "You got the scholarship route, right? That's dope, man. They love the diversity angle. You're like a unicorn on campus." Deshaun didn't laugh. The others did, awkwardly, politely, like people too privileged to notice the insult they were endorsing. In the classroom, the scrutiny grew heavier. If he arrived a few minutes late, professors glanced longer at him than others. If he challenged a reading, they reminded him to keep discussions civil. If he cited sources they didn't expect a kid from Baton Rouge to know, they double-checked his citations, as though plagiarism was more likely than proficiency. He wasn't seen as excellent. He was seen as exceptional. For a black kid from a poor neighborhood, that unspoken asterisk followed him everywhere. By his second semester, the whispers began to thicken. He overheard a conversation outside the library, one evening. A pair of well-dressed business majors speaking too loud to be unaware. He's only here 'cause he checks all the boxes, black, broke, and brilliant enough to make them look good. It's PR gold. Deshaun didn't confront them. He just tightened his backpack straps and walked past, each step heavier than the last. Every time he heard words like merit, equity, or diversity, they no longer inspired hope. They sounded like cold marketing tactics. But despite it all, he excelled. Straight A's, published essays, invitations to student panels. Professors began to take notice, some with admiration, others with suspicion, and among them was Professor Allen. Allen had never taught him before that fateful class, but Deshaun had heard the rumors, how Allen's courses were a crucible, how he didn't lower standards, how he didn't believe in coddling modern students. That was code for a lot of things, but especially for students who didn't come from prep schools or Ivy League families. From the moment Deshaun stepped into his class, the professor's gaze lingered. Allen asked more follow-up questions after Deshaun spoke, interrupted him more often, and graded his essays with remarks like argument lacks polish and overreaches without merit, despite Deshaun citing peer-reviewed journals. One week, when a white student lifted whole arguments from a popular blog, Allen called it provocative synthesis. That same week, Deshaun's original research paper was returned with a B-. and a warning about academic tone. He didn't say anything at first, but the real test came when Deshaun raised a question about the university's involvement in gentrifying local black neighborhoods, a topic tied to a required reading. Alan's smile tightened like a noose. "I think you're confusing sociology with conspiracy theories," the professor said coldly, dismissing the data Deshaun had spent weeks collecting. "Let's stick to scholarship, not sentimentality." From that day, it was war. But one only Deshaun seemed to know he was in. He noticed his name wasn't on the invite list for the departmental honors seminar, despite qualifying. When he asked about it, he was told there were limited slots and more competitive applicants. He wasn't even offered feedback. The silent erosion of his confidence began to show. He double-checked his work obsessively, stopped volunteering in class, stopped attending student panels. His world shrank to just grades and solitude. And in that silence, his sense of self-worth began to wither. He had done everything right, worked harder, sacrificed more, and still it felt like he was being slowly pushed toward the edge of a cliff no one else could see. Then came the envelope. It was slid under his dorm door one morning. No name, just a crisp white folder sealed with the university crest. Inside were photocopied pages, heavily annotated in red ink. At first glance, it looked like standard grading material. But then he saw the name at the top, Renee Delgado, a student from 2 years ago. The comments were sharp, dismissive, and laced with troubling patterns. Every critique echoed a familiar tone. Too passionate, not academically rigorous. Questionable relevance. Each remark was followed by a grade that dropped with every mention of race-related topics. Deshaun flipped through page after page. Different students, different semesters, always the same pattern. Students of color marked down when they questioned power structures. White students praised for ambition or audacity when making similar arguments. It wasn't proof yet, but it was a pattern. A dangerous, unmistakable pattern. His heart pounded. This wasn't just about him anymore. Professor Allen had a history, a buried trail of academic sabotage cloaked in institutional language, and someone had risked a lot to make sure Deshaun saw it. But he knew what this meant. If he brought this forward, it wouldn't just be about right and wrong. It would be about taking on a tenured professor protected by years of silence, power, and politics. Exposing him could mean academic exile. It could mean losing everything. The scholarship, the grades, the fragile place he'd carved out for himself in a system that never wanted him to belong in the first place. Still holding the folder, Deshaun looked out his dorm window at the marble halls of Northbrook, their shine now colder than ever. If he stayed quiet, he'd keep his safety. But if he spoke, he might finally find justice. Deshaun couldn't sleep. The folder with the photocopied evaluation sat on his desk like a curse, its contents infecting every thought, every breath. Each time he tried to drift off, he saw those red ink annotations again, echoes of Professor Allen's voice filtered through years of cruelty, all masked behind academic language. His dorm room, usually a sanctuary after long days on campus, now felt like a trap filled with echoes of injustice. At 2:13 a.m., unable to bear the weight in his chest, he opened his laptop, half out of desperation, half out of instinct. He didn't know what he was searching for at first. He typed Professor Benjamin Allen reviews, expecting Rate My Professor rants about workload or boring lectures. But buried deep in the search results, nearly lost in the endless scroll, was a link to a forgotten Reddit thread. RF Academic Justice. Let's talk about Northbrook University's Golden Boy. The post was over a year old, posted by a now deleted user, but it had over 700 upvotes and nearly 300 comments. As Deshaun clicked into it, a chill rippled down his spine. The thread read like a graveyard of stolen futures. Anonymous users, many claiming to be former students or staff, shared eerily similar stories. One wrote, "Had a 3.9 GPA until I took Allen's ethics course. Called out racial bias in a reading. My grade dropped from an A to a C. Tried to appeal. Nothing happened." Another, "He told me my essay was overly emotional. It was on the black maternal mortality rate. I have the feedback. Still hurts to read." One commenter said they filed a complaint with the department. A week later, their access to departmental tutoring was revoked. Coincidence? They asked bitterly. I don't think so. Each comment was a thread. Together they wove a tapestry of systemic cruelty. Unspoken, unproven, but painfully real. Allen didn't just grade harshly. He punished dissent, especially from black students, especially when they dared to question power. Deshaun read every word, his fingers trembling, his mouth dry. These weren't outliers. These were patterns. Names blurred, timelines scattered, but the pain echoed. Alan's victims didn't just suffer academic damage, they carried emotional bruises, long after leaving Northbrook. As he scrolled, a particular comment stood out. It was longer, more composed, written with the clarity of someone who had lived through hell and come out ready to speak truth. The username was Black Sparrow 94. The post began with, "I used to believe I wasn't good enough for academia. Then I realized I was never meant to succeed in Alan's class." The user detailed how they'd lost a research grant because of a single professor's letter of lukewarm recommendation, how they were encouraged to drop out of an honors thesis after Alan dismissed their topic as too niche for serious scholarship. It was about redlining in post-war Chicago. The story ended with a line that hit Deshaun like a punch to the gut. He doesn't ruin careers in one blow. He chips away at you until you stop believing you belong. And then, at the bottom of the comment, a surprising twist. If anyone reading this still attends Northbrook and is dealing with Alan, reach out. I'm not afraid anymore. The comment included an encrypted email. Deshaun copied it, stared at it for several minutes, then drafted a message that simply said, "I need to talk." It's happening again. He didn't expect a reply that night. But 20 minutes later, his inbox lit up. Subject: Ray, Alan. Message: "You're not alone. But if we talk, it has to be off campus. You pick the place. No phones. No recordings. Just truth." The name at the bottom was Sarah Montgomery. Deshaun recognized it immediately. She had once been a rising star in the university's political science department. Top of her class, research assistant to 2 professors, and an early candidate for a prestigious fellowship. Then she vanished. Word on campus was that she dropped out suddenly. Some said she had a breakdown. Others hinted at drama with faculty. But nobody really knew. Now she was back. Not as a student, but as someone who carried the same scars. They arranged to meet at a quiet diner off campus the next evening. Deshaun wore a hoodie and kept his head down the entire bus ride. His heart pounded with every stop. What if it was a setup? What if Alan had people watching him? The paranoia was real, but so was the urgency. When he stepped into the diner, the smell of burnt coffee and fried onions wrapped around him. At a back booth, facing the exit, sat Sarah. Older than he expected, mid to late 20s, with sharp eyes and tired shoulders. She nodded once, as he sat across from her. "No phone?" she asked softly. He showed her his empty pockets. "No recording," he replied. She nodded again. Then, without hesitation, she began. "Alan broke me," she said. "But he didn't start with me. He's been doing this for years. Always in ways that look just clean enough to get away with. Low grades without clear rubrics. Poor recommendations despite strong GPAs. Discrediting research topics he doesn't like, especially if they deal with race, injustice, or anything that challenges the status quo." Deshaun listened. Every word a confirmation. Every detail a wound. "But here's the part that made me stop trusting the system," she continued, leaning in. "When I filed a formal complaint, it disappeared. I followed up. They said it never existed. The professor I confided in suddenly stopped speaking to me. My advisor ghosted me. It was like I became toxic. Alan didn't just survive. He was protected." Deshaun clenched his jaw. "By who?" She shrugged. "No idea. But someone up there wants him untouched. And if you're trying to fight him, be ready. The system doesn't reward whistleblowers. It buries them." He felt the weight of her words settle into his bones. She wasn't exaggerating. She was warning him. But she added, reaching into her bag, "You're not starting from scratch." She pulled out a flash drive, placing it between them like a loaded weapon. "This has copies of my original papers. The ones Alan failed. The audio from the meeting where he told me my topic was emotionally manipulative. Screenshots of my grade before and after I filed the complaint. It's not everything, but it's a start." Deshaun stared at it, hesitant. "Why me?" "Because," she said, her voice firm now, "he did to you what he did to me. And you still stood up. That means something." Deshaun took the flash drive, heart racing. He had proof now. But also, responsibility. Sarah had risked being erased a second time just to give him this. And if what she said was true, using it wouldn't just expose Alan. It could unravel the university's quiet system of protection around him. As they stood to leave, Sarah touched his arm lightly. "Be careful, Deshaun. The higher you rise, the harder they come for you. Alan's just one face of a much bigger beast." Outside, the night air slapped him awake. He walked in silence, the flash drive clenched in his fist. What he didn't see, across the street, was a figure watching him from a dark sedan, engine running, eyes locked on him through tinted glass. The next evening, as rain softly tapped the windows of Northbrook's main library, Deshaun made his way through the ancient hallways, heart pounding with quiet urgency. He'd memorized the route Sarah had given him down the stairs past the third floor, through the back archive hallway, to a maintenance door with no visible sign, just a coded lock-tech. She'd sent the code earlier, and now he punched it in with trembling fingers. The beep was faint, followed by a slow mechanical click. He pushed the door open, stepping into the forgotten underbelly of the school. The basement was colder than he expected, and quieter than any space should be. It smelled like damp paper and forgotten history. The overhead lights flickered inconsistently, leaving shadows that danced across rows of boxed files and discarded microfilm readers. It was the kind of place where secrets lingered in the air, the kind that didn't just echo, they watched. Sarah was already there, sitting at an old wooden table near a wall of filing cabinets, her blonde hair tied up, her expression sharper than yesterday. Gone was the cautious woman he met at the diner. Tonight, she looked resolute, almost battle-hardened. She nodded once as he approached but didn't smile. There wasn't room for pleasantries. "You came alone?" she asked. Deshaun nodded. "And unarmed," he said lightly, trying to diffuse the tension. She didn't laugh, just motioned to the chair across from her. On the table sat a black USB drive. Plain, small, silent. But the way she stared at it, you'd think it was radioactive. "What's on it?" he asked, not touching it yet. "Proof," she said, leaning forward, her voice low. "Not just my case. Others. More than I told you." Deshaun's brows furrowed. "You said your files, your audio." "And then I remembered something," she interrupted. "Back when I was Alan's teaching assistant, I had access to archived course folders, internal memos, grade logs, peer review records. I wasn't supposed to, but Alan was lazy with digital privacy, never logged out, reused passwords. I saw things I wasn't supposed to, and I copied them." Her eyes were lit with something close to fury now. "Deshaun, Allen's not just racist in the classroom. He's part of something bigger. That drive has grade manipulation reports, student evaluations with edited comments, staff memos where he actively campaigned against student grants. Always minority students. Always phrased in ways that sound objective. One professor even flagged his pattern. And you know what happened? That professor got reassigned." Deshaun felt like the ground beneath the library was shifting. He looked at the USB again, now aware of the weight it carried. This wasn't just about personal vendetta anymore. This wasn't about one bad grade or one public humiliation. This was systemic rot, rooted in power, protected by protocol. He leaned in. "Why didn't you go public with it back then?" Sarah's face tightened. "Because I was scared. Because I thought no one would believe me. Because I was useful to them, as long as I kept quiet. Once I opened my mouth, even a little, I lost everything. My TA position, my recommendation letters, and eventually, my spot in the PhD program." Her voice cracked on that last word. "They erased me without ever having to fire me." Deshaun's hands curled into fists under the table. "So why now? Why help me?" Sarah looked at him with clear eyes, the kind that had seen enough betrayal to know sincerity when it walked in the room. "Because you didn't shrink. Even when Alan humiliated you, even when they tried to silence you, you didn't fold. That kind of defiance? It's rare here. It matters. I've been waiting for someone like you." A silence settled between them, not empty, but heavy with meaning. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small folder, sliding it toward him. Names of others who were targeted. Most have left. Some might still be here, too scared to talk. But one of them, she was a star in the law department. Lost her entire final year after challenging Alan's grading in a cross-listed course. Deshaun opened the folder. The first name on the list made his breath catch. Janelle Whitaker. He remembered her. A fiery black law student who had led campus protests 2 years ago against discriminatory housing policies. She'd vanished after one semester into Alan's lecture series. Rumors said she transferred. Others claimed she was expelled. "Where is she now?" he asked. Sarah shrugged. "No idea. She stopped answering emails. Deleted all social media. Like she disappeared. But if you can find her, she's the missing piece." Deshaun tucked the folder into his backpack and picked up the USB with the reverence of someone holding a lit fuse. "Are you sure about this?" he asked her. "No," she said quietly. "But I'm sure I can't live with the silence anymore." He stood, zipped his bag, and nodded once. As he turned to leave, she added, "Be careful who you trust. This university doesn't protect students. It protects itself." He looked back at her one last time. "I know." Outside the basement, the hallway was darker than before. As he stepped back into the stairwell, the sound of a door clicking shut echoed louder than it should have. He turned. No one was there. He climbed the stairs fast, two at a time, adrenaline now pulsing with the weight of knowledge. In his hands he carried a bomb of truth. And behind him, somewhere deep in the library's quiet maze, something or someone was watching. As he exited the building and disappeared into the rain-soaked night, a red light blinked quietly on a nearby security camera, recording everything. And someone, from somewhere unseen, was watching him leave. The moment Deshaun locked the door to his dorm that night, he didn't even take off his backpack. He moved like a man carrying a secret too volatile to rest. With the room still cloaked in silence and the faint drizzle outside rhythmically tapping against the window, he sat at his desk, plugged in the USB Sarah had given him, and waited. The computer screen blinked once, then opened to a list of folders, neatly organized, coldly labeled, and terrifyingly clear. It wasn't just the amount of data that unsettled him. It was how clinical it all was. Years of manipulation, concealed under the sterile language of academia. The first folder was labeled Student Evaluations, Altered. Inside were PDFs, side-by-side comparisons of original student evaluations, and the edited versions that Allen had submitted to departmental review boards. Deshaun's breath caught as he opened the first file. A student had written, "Professor Allen was dismissive when I discussed black feminist theory. He made jokes that felt racially charged." In the submitted version, the line was gone, replaced by, "Professor Allen encouraged academic debate, but set high standards." It wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated erasure. The next folder was worse. Grade logs, manual adjustments. A spreadsheet revealed rows of student names, some redacted, some fully visible, each followed by original grade entries. Then modifications, all time-stamped, all traced to Allen's login credentials. Deshaun scrolled down and stopped cold when he saw his own name. His midterm essay had been initially marked as A, then downgraded to a C+ within 4 hours. No feedback, no change in the document. Just a shift in data, invisible unless you knew where to look. His hands were shaking now. Another folder, audio recordings. He clicked on the first file, and Allen's unmistakable voice filled the room, too calm, too measured. "I don't believe in diluting academic rigor to accommodate cultural perspectives. We're here to teach philosophy, not sociology." Another clip, "If they can't handle the material without making it about race, perhaps they're not ready for serious academic environments." The bile rose in Deshaun's throat. He paused the recording, unable to hear more. This wasn't just academic gatekeeping. This was targeted intellectual suppression. He reached for his notebook, the same one from class, the one Allen had ridiculed, and started jotting down notes, connecting dates, names, folder structures. He knew he'd need to build a timeline, something indisputable. But even as he worked, a darker realization crept in. Sarah hadn't just handed him proof. She'd handed him a loaded gun, and whoever controlled the university's narrative already knew the weight of this kind of ammunition. At 3:04 a.m., after hours of going through files, he sent an encrypted backup of the USB contents to a hidden cloud folder and deleted all traces from the laptop. Then, cautiously, he opened a second browser and started researching how to file an internal grievance with the university. That's when he found it, buried deep in the Office of Academic Affairs website, a document titled Whistleblower Policy Addendum. Section. It detailed how any student accusing a tenured faculty member of misconduct involving academic decisions must provide unbiased third-party documentation and submit to an administrative review panel. And if the claims were found to be based on incomplete or misrepresented data, the student could face suspension for defamation of faculty reputation. His heart stopped. The policy wasn't a shield. It was a trap. Suddenly, everything Sarah said made sense. The professor who flagged Allen, reassigned. Sarah's complaint, disappeared. The university hadn't just ignored Allen's behavior. It had designed a system to bury it. The room felt smaller now. The walls closer. He leaned back, his eyes scanning the ceiling like it might give him answers. How was he supposed to fight this? Every official channel led to a dead end, or a punishment. And he didn't just have grades at stake. His financial aid was under review due to a recent funding shift. One false move could jeopardize everything. His degree, his housing, even the food stipend that kept him fed. For a moment he wondered if staying quiet was the smarter option. Just focus on the upcoming exam, finish the semester, get the diploma, and get out. Let someone else take up the fight later. But that thought barely lasted, because that folder with his name, the grade that had been altered, that wasn't just a red mark. That was the scar of silence. And silence was what they were betting on. He closed the laptop slowly, took a deep breath, and turned off the desk lamp. The city outside was still dark, the campus bathed in rain-soaked stillness. As he stared into the night, he whispered to himself, "Not this time." The next morning exhaustion clung to him like fog. He skipped his first class and instead headed to the student law center, hoping to find some loophole, some way to report without self-destruction. But when he arrived, he found the door locked, a typed note taped to the glass, temporarily closed due to staffing limitations. Please check back next week. It felt deliberate, too well-timed. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. They know you have it. Don't go public. He froze. The message had no name, no context, but the meaning was clear. His pulse raced. He hadn't told anyone outside of Sarah. No posts, no leaks, no emails with attachments. So how? Another message followed, seconds later. Unknown number. If you want help, meet me. Off campus, 7 p.m. sharp. Location coming. He hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. A setup? A threat? Or maybe, just maybe, someone on the inside. He typed back one word. Who? The reply came instantly. A faculty member who knows the truth. But if you talk, we all burn. The message haunted Deshaun for the rest of the day. A faculty member who knows the truth. It lingered in his mind as he sat through his remaining classes, half listening while the world around him buzzed on, oblivious. Each hallway he passed through suddenly felt watched. Every faculty member's passing glance felt like a code to decipher. Even the students seemed quieter around him now, like word of his defiance had slipped beneath the surface, circulating through whispers, eye contact, and silence. At 6:49 p.m., his phone vibrated again. Unknown number. South faculty lot. Bench near the sculpture. No phones. No friends. The rain had stopped by then, but the wind carried a chill that made the trees shiver. Deshaun slipped on his hoodie, zipped up his jacket, and tucked the USB drive deep into the lining of his coat. He told no one, not even Marcus. Some things had to be carried alone. The South faculty lot was merely empty, the bronze sculpture of interlocking circles casting long shadows in the setting sun. And there, seated at the stone bench just as promised, was a man Deshaun had seen many times before but never really seen. Dr. Harold Nolan. He was a tenured professor in the history department, known for his soft-spoken lectures and encyclopedic knowledge of African American resistance movements. He didn't attend faculty mixers. He never raised his voice in meetings. He moved through the university like smoke, present, but easy to overlook. And yet now, here he was, waiting, hands clasped over his lap, eyes sharp behind thick glasses. You came, Dr. Nolan said as Deshaun approached. Good. Deshaun stood for a moment, uncertain. How did you know? I saw what you've been doing, Nolan interrupted gently, patting the space beside him, and I knew it was time. Deshaun sat slowly, scanning the parking lot. Empty. Quiet. But he still kept his voice low. How long have you known about Alan? Nolan gave a bitter chuckle. Too long. But knowing and proving are two very different things here. Alan's protected. He has connections, not just in the department, but in the boardroom. The kind of men who believe tradition matters more than justice. And you never spoke out? Deshaun's voice had a blade of accusation in it. I tried, Nolan said simply. Years ago. I flagged inconsistencies in his grading. I submitted reports about comments students repeated to me. I even spoke to the dean privately. You know what happened? He paused. I was advised to maintain academic solidarity. That's how they say, shut up or lose your funding. And I had just secured a grant for the African Diaspora Archive. If I pushed harder, it would have been gone. Deshaun's jaw clenched. So they knew. They always know, Nolan said, looking out at the empty road. But they only act when silence costs more than the truth. He turned to Deshaun. Which is why what you have, the USB, the student files, the grade edits, it changes everything. But it also puts a target on your back. Deshaun nodded slowly. So what now? Dr. Nolan leaned in. Now we build pressure. You take that exam, and you ace it. Not just pass, Crush it. Make it impossible to justify whatever Mark Allen tries to give you. Then we go public. I'll leak the first round of evidence anonymously to a trusted journalist I know. You'll share your story with screenshots, timestamps, everything. We make it a firestorm. One the university can't contain. And then we let the board decide whether Allen's worth burning for. Because once this goes public, it won't just be his name on the line. It'll be the school's reputation, donor relations, federal oversight. They'll have to choose protect one man, or save their empire. Deshaun was quiet for a long moment. What happens to me if they pick him? You'll lose, Nolan said, honest as stone. They'll bury your academic record, label you unstable, quietly revoke your scholarship. They'll make sure no grad school touches your name. That's their blueprint. It's been used before. Why risk it? Deshaun asked, eyes narrowing. Why help me now? Dr. Nolan's voice softened. Because I watched too many bright young black students fade out of this place. Not because they weren't good enough, but because this place convinced them they weren't. I should have spoken louder when it happened to Janelle, to Daryl, to Asha. You remind me of all of them. And maybe helping you is how I make peace with staying quiet back then. The wind picked up, tugging at the leaves, swirling them in uneasy circles around their feet. Deshaun stared at the sculpture in front of them. Those metal rings twisting in and out of each other, like promises and lies fused together. You think I can really beat him? He asked finally. Dr. Nolan looked him dead in the eye. You already have. Now it's about making sure the world sees it. They parted without a handshake. Just a shared nod. An understanding forged not from trust but from truth. That night, Deshaun didn't sleep. He studied until his eyes ached, reread every chapter of the syllabus, cross-referenced footnotes, memorized case studies. He wasn't just preparing for an exam. He was preparing for war, on paper, in prose, within the narrow confines of Allen's carefully biased test. By 2 a.m., Marcus finally noticed something was wrong. Bro, you haven't said a word all night, he muttered, glancing over from his desk. You good? Deshaun looked up, the exhaustion in his eyes barely masked. I'm good. But just as he was about to tell Marcus everything, the USB Nolan, the plan, his phone buzzed again. No contact. No subject. Just a single-line message that chilled his blood. Withdraw, or you'll regret it. He read it twice, 3 times. The sender's number was masked. No trace. No reply possible. Marcus noticed his expression change. Yo. What's wrong? Deshaun didn't answer. His fingers trembled as he locked the phone and set it face down. Outside, the wind slammed against the windows, as if something unseen was clawing to get in. The anonymous message, withdraw, or you'll regret it, echoed in Deshaun's mind long after he set his phone down. It seemed to vibrate through the walls, pulsing like a warning buried in the air itself. For nearly an hour he sat motionless on the edge of his bed, staring at the dim reflection in the window, trying to convince himself it was nothing more than scare tactics. But beneath that thin layer of reason lay something colder, the gut-deep instinct that someone out there knew exactly how close he had come to exposing everything. The thought crawled across his skin, refusing to be shaken off. Even Marcus's concerned glances weren't enough to break the tension stretching silently between them. When Marcus finally fell asleep, Deshaun remained awake, unable to silence the buzzing in his mind. Near midnight, the dorm grew quiet, too quiet, like the building itself was holding its breath. Deshaun tried to force himself back to his notes, but his focus splintered every few minutes. Shadows stretched in corners where they didn't belong. Every whisper of wind outside made him look up. It wasn't paranoia, not fully. He'd seen what the institution did to people who pushed against its walls, but knowing he was being watched, threatened, and warned, made the night grow longer, its edges sharp and unforgiving. He pressed a hand against his chest, as if to steady his heartbeat, and whispered to himself, "You can't stop now." It was the only thing keeping him anchored. The first crash was so violent that it didn't sound real. For a moment he thought a transformer outside had blown. But then came the second shatter, the unmistakable sound of glass exploding inward. Marcus jerked awake, shouting as cold air blasted through the room. A brick lay on the floor, surrounded by shards glittering like cruel confetti. Attached to it was a strip of paper, hastily taped, the handwriting jagged, and rushed. Know your place. The words punched harder than the brick ever could. Deshaun stepped forward slowly, as if the floor had turned unstable beneath him. His hands trembled when he picked up the note, not out of fear but fury. fury that was no longer quiet or contained. Marcus cursed under his breath and ran to the door, looking down the hallway as if expecting someone to still be standing there. But the corridor was empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing indifferently overhead. Whoever had done it was already gone, swallowed by the night. Campus security arrived 20 minutes later. 2 officers, one yawning, one taking lazy photos with a tablet. Their questions were shallow, procedural, and stripped of any urgency. Do you have enemies? You sure it wasn't a prank? You kids get dramatic during finals? One officer even chuckled, shaking his head like Deshaun was overreacting. When Deshaun held up the note, the officer barely squinted at it, before shrugging, probably someone messing around. We'll file a report, but nothing suggests targeted harassment. Marcus exploded. A brick through a 4th-floor window isn't a prank. But the officer only sighed, closed his tablet and said the phrase that would replay in Deshaun's mind long after they left. Don't blow this out of proportion. The implication was unmistakable. When black students spoke, their pain had to be translated, softened, reshaped before anyone deemed it worth hearing. After the officers left, Deshaun's scholarship advisor called in response to the incident report. Her voice, flat and overly calm, made his skin tighten. She offered hollow sympathy, then slid into the real purpose of the call. With tensions so high, perhaps it's best if you focus on your exam and maintain a low profile. Visibility right now could jeopardize your academic progress. She didn't say jeopardize your funding, but he heard it anyway. The warning behind her polished tone was as clear as the threat written on the torn strip of paper. When the call ended, Marcus looked at him in disbelief. Bro, they're trying to scare you into silence. Don't you see that? Deshaun did see it. He saw it in every dismissal, every forced smile, every institutional hand gesture that said, without us you are nothing. But instead of fear tightening around him, something unfamiliar began to rise, something heavy and resolute. This wasn't the first time someone tried to define his place, and it wouldn't be the last time he refused to stay in it. He swept the broken glass into a dustpan, with slow, steady movements, each piece glinting like fragments of the world they were trying to keep him in. His hands shook, not because he was frightened, but because he was exhausted from pretending he wasn't. The cold air from the broken window drifted through the room, carrying with it a sense of exposure yet also clarity. As he taped a trash bag over the shattered frame, the darkness outside stared back at him like an adversary he was finally ready to face. Marcus hovered behind him, quieter now. You don't have to take the exam, you know, he whispered. None of this is worth your safety. But Deshaun straightened, meeting his friend's worried gaze. It is worth it, he said softly. Not because of the exam, because of everything they think they can get away with. He didn't have the privilege of retreat. His very presence was already a rebellion. And the more they tried to break him, the more he understood that surviving here with dignity was the victory they didn't want him to reach. So rather than rest, he turned back to his desk, opened his textbook, and began reading again. Not out of fear, but defiance. Each paragraph he absorbed became an act of resistance. Each highlighted sentence, a reminder that the exam wasn't just academic. It was a battlefield, and he intended to walk into it armed with every fact, every theory, every insight that Alan wished to weaponize against him. The hours past midnight, bled into early dawn. The glow of his desk lamp carved a small sanctuary around him, a barrier against the darkness trying to infiltrate his focus. He read until the words blurred, then read them again. His back ached, his eyes burned, but he refused to break. By the time the first streaks of pale morning light slipped across the floor, he had finished not just reviewing the material, he had mastered it. There was a sharpness in him now, forged from fear, anger, and purpose. And beneath it all, a quiet certainty. He was ready. He showered, dressed in clean clothes, and packed his bag methodically, adding the USB drive last. The hallways outside were alive with the usual morning rush, but as he walked through them, a strange sensation followed him, like the world had dimmed around the edges, narrowing its focus solely on him. Students glanced up, some with curiosity, others with pity. A few whispered, their hushed tones trailing behind him. He didn't need to hear the words to understand the tone. Is he really going to show up today? Doesn't he know what he's risking? He did, and he showed up anyway. The exam hall loomed ahead, the tall wooden doors glossy and imposing. Students gathered outside in clusters, flipping through last-minute notes or nervously tapping pencils. When Deshaun approached, conversations faltered. A few eyes widened. One student took a subtle step away from him, as if being near him carried consequences. But Deshaun kept walking, steady and expressionless, his gaze fixed forward. He reached for the door handle. Before his fingers touched it, a shadow blocked his path. Professor Allen, standing firm, arms crossed, expression carved from ice. "You won't be entering," he said quietly, each word sharpened to precision. "Your registration was never verified." Deshaun froze, not because he believed the lie, but because of the smug certainty in Allen's voice. The kind that came from knowing the system would back him. "But I paid," Deshaun said, jaw tight. "You saw the receipt." Allen stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper edged in venom. "Not today, Mr. Miller. You should have listened when warned." Behind him, the exam hall door opened slightly, students peering out in confusion. Deshaun's breath caught. The exam, the one that could determine his entire academic future, was happening inches away, and he was being blocked. Deshaun's hand hovered just inches from the door handle when Professor Allen stepped into his path like a well-rehearsed barricade. For a split second there was no sound, not from the students behind him whispering in confusion, not from the faculty pacing inside the lecture hall, not even from the wind that still rattled the glass windows along the hallway. Everything paused. Time itself seemed to take a breath. "You won't be entering," Allen said with a false calm, like he was discussing a clerical error, not executing a calculated dismissal. "Your registration was never verified." It wasn't just the words, it was the smugness in his tone, the precision of his timing. Allen had waited until Deshaun arrived, had waited until the exam was about to begin, until the hall was full and the stakes were at their highest. He wanted this to be public. He wanted Deshaun humiliated. Deshaun didn't blink. "That's a lie," he said, clear and unwavering. Allen's eyes narrowed. "I reviewed the roster myself. No record of payment. No administrative over." "You're the one who removed it," Deshaun said, louder this time. "You altered the system." The students behind them, already half curious from the unusual tension, began inching closer. The energy in the hallway shifted. Eyes widened. Phones came out. Silent, but unmistakable. Allen noticed it too. His lips pressed into a thin, forced smile. "Mr. Miller, please don't escalate. You're disrupting the academic environment." Deshaun reached into his bag, slowly, carefully. First he pulled out the printed payment confirmation, stamped with the bursar's office seal, and time-stamped. Then, a second page, a signed letter of accommodation from Dr. Nolan, granting him permission to sit for the exam, even in case of clerical delay. And finally, a small audio recorder, which had been running since the moment Allen opened his mouth. "I came prepared," Deshaun said, loud enough now for everyone to hear. "Because I knew you'd try this." A hush fell. One girl in the crowd gasped audibly. Another whispered, "He's recording him." He caught him. Allen's expression tightened like a mask cracking at the edges. "Put that away. You're not authorized to record faculty without consent." "I'm recording a public interaction in a public hallway," Deshaun replied, "where you're denying me access to an exam I paid for. That's not private. It's abuse of power." The recorder sat in Deshaun's open palm like a loaded weapon, and for the first time Allen seemed to realize he was no longer in full control. The authority he had wielded so confidently, flawless grades, withheld opportunities, threats hidden behind professionalism, was unraveling in real time, thread by thread. The hallway was full now. Students were no longer pretending not to look. Some had begun filming, and Deshaun stood calm in the center of it. Shoulders squared, eyes steady, his evidence stacked neatly like a quiet defiance built on months of pain. "I have every right to be here," he continued, "and I have every right to take this exam." Allen tried again, his voice sharpening. "Mr. Miller, I'm warning you." But this time Deshaun cut him off. "No, I'm warning you. Every second you keep me out of that hall is going in this recording. Every student here is watching it happen, and every one of them knows exactly why." A voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Heads turned. A woman in a navy blue blazer, heels clicking against the tile floor, approached with a clipboard and an expression as unreadable as stone. Dean Lyle, Associate Provost, one of the university's most powerful administrators. Allen's posture shifted just slightly, but Deshaun noticed. The mask returned. "Dean Lyle, perfect timing," Allen said, turning toward her. "This student appears to be confused about his eligibility. I've already explained the registration issue." She didn't reply immediately. Her eyes flicked from Allen to Deshaun, then to the crowd, then back to the receipt in Deshaun's hand. Her face didn't show emotion, but her silence was its own kind of tension. "Mr. Miller," she said finally, "may I see your documentation?" Deshawn handed it over wordlessly. She scanned it, then scanned it again. When she reached the signature on Dr. Nolan's letter, something in her expression twitched barely, but it was there. A crack. "And this was submitted when?" she asked. "Yesterday. I followed protocol," Deshawn said. Everything was cleared. "This denial isn't about paperwork. It's about intimidation." More murmurs now. The students were inching even closer, phones raised discreetly, but clearly recording. Alan saw them too. The threat wasn't just Deshawn anymore. It was every witness with a camera. Dean Lyle handed the papers back. "The documents are valid," she said. "Mr. Miller is permitted to take the exam." Alan's mouth opened, but she cut him off without looking. "You'll ensure he receives the exam promptly. Any delay and I'll consider it interference." The hallway burst into whispers. Deshawn didn't move. He stared at Alan, waiting. Alan stepped aside reluctantly, mechanically, like a man being forced to retreat from territory he believed was his birthright. Deshawn walked past him, slow and deliberate, each step heavy with a history only he could feel. But just as he reached the door, Dean Lyle touched his shoulder gently. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice lower now, almost a whisper, "may I speak with you privately after the exam?" Deshawn hesitated. "Why?" She offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Let's just say, I think we should discuss the bigger picture." He nodded once, then stepped into the lecture hall. Rows of students already seated looked up as he entered. Some recognized him from the hallway. Others didn't, but sensed the shift in energy. He walked to his seat, unpacked his pen, his ID, and waited for the exam to begin. But even as the paper was passed to him, and the room settled into tense silence, one thought burned through his mind. Dean Lyle had just sided with him, in public. But why? And what was waiting for him in that private meeting? The moment Deshawn stepped into the exam hall, it didn't feel like just another academic setting. It felt like a courtroom, a battlefield, a stage where everything he had endured was about to be judged in silence. Dozens of eyes trailed him as he crossed the room. Some were curious, others uncertain. A few held the dull glint of guilt. Students who had once laughed along, who had stayed quiet, who had looked away. But none of them mattered now. Not the murmurs, not the glances, not even the shadows of what had nearly broken him. All that mattered was the test, and what he had come here to prove. He sat in the second row, dead center, in plain view of the invigilator, and in full line of sight of Alan, who now stood at the front of the room, with the stiffness of a man forced into theater. He didn't speak a word to Deshawn, not even a glance. Instead, he handed off the stack of exam packets to the proctor, and stepped aside like a general forced to watch his enemy march freely onto the field. The proctor moved down the rows, dropping exam booklets with a practiced rhythm. As Deshawn received his fingers paused over the cover, Phil 342 Ethics and Power Structures, an irony not lost on him. He pulled out his pen, closed his eyes for 2 seconds, and exhaled through his nose. Then he opened the booklet. The questions were what he expected. Challenging, dense, layered in philosophical jargon. But beneath their wording, he saw Alan's fingerprints. Each prompt was crafted like a trap. One asked for a defense of traditional hierarchy in academic institutions. Another questioned the validity of emotional bias in ethical debates. One prompt even demanded a response to the quote, "In order to maintain order, discomfort must exist." Deshawn stared at that one the longest. He could see the setup. If he responded with emotion, they'd say he was being reactive. If he responded with too much restraint, they'd say he lacked depth. But Deshawn didn't choose either extreme. Instead, he blended intellect with lived experience, dissecting the prompt with surgical precision. He wrote about discomfort as a manufactured barrier, how institutions often mistake silence for order, and how discomfort was selectively applied to suppress the marginalized, to reinforce existing hierarchies, to protect the comfort of those in power. His pen flew. Every answer became a strike, every paragraph, a rebellion. He referenced Audre Lorde Foucault, bell hooks, and Baldwin, tying in coursework while weaving in truths. Alan never wanted written. The room around him blurred. Time became elastic. He didn't just write to pass. He wrote to expose, to challenge, to make the exam itself a statement. Other students began to shift nervously. Some looked over at Deshawn and saw not a classmate but a storm contained in one chair. His focus was total. The quiet scratch of his pen became rhythmic, almost meditative. In that room full of privilege and silence, Deshaun wrote not like someone trying to earn a grade, but like someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to say. 2 hours in, his hand cramped, but he didn't stop. When the ink in his primary pen faded, he pulled out a backup and kept going. The proctor passed behind him once, then again peeking at his pages. She didn't speak, but her raised brow said everything. Deshaun had filled not just the standard blue book, but 2 more supplemental sheets. Every answer was dense, annotated with cross-references and historical parallels. He didn't write safe. He wrote truth. By the final 30 minutes, a subtle tension filled the hall. Some students had already submitted and left quietly. Others remained, wrestling with prompts they had skimmed through in class. Deshaun, however, had moved beyond the mechanics of testing. He was dismantling the structure Alan had built, right there, on the very paper Alan had expected would bury him. And then just as the clock hit the final 5-minute mark, he wrote a final sentence that he hadn't planned, hadn't rehearsed. It came from somewhere deeper. The ethical failure of power is not that it exists, but that it demands silence from those it harms most. He underlined it. Then he closed his booklet. When he stood and walked to the front of the room, Alan was nowhere in sight. The proctor took his exam with a brief nod. No smile, no words, but her eyes lingered on his for a second longer than necessary. Not pity, something else. Respect. Deshaun stepped out into the light, heart racing, legs heavy. The air felt different, as if something sacred had just been unleashed. He knew the exam alone wouldn't fix what had been broken, but it was a beginning. He had written himself into a truth they could no longer ignore. Back at his dorm, Marcus was waiting. "You good?" he asked, as soon as Deshaun entered. Deshaun nodded, dropping his bag. "I didn't just take the test," he said. "I rewrote it." He collapsed onto his bed, too drained to speak more, the weight of everything finally pressing down. That night, he slept for the first time in days. Deep, unshaken sleep. But the victory was short-lived. 2 days later, the department announced grades would be released early due to internal processing improvements. Students buzzed about it. Some joked that it was the school's way of boosting morale before finals. Deshaun, however, felt the unease return. He logged into his portal the minute the grades went live. He scrolled past minor courses. Found Phil 342. Click. Final grade. His breath caught. He blinked. Refreshed the page. Still
No comments, no feedback, no record of rubric violations.
just a single cold letter, the same weapon they had used before. And then again, and now again. Marcus saw the screen and nearly knocked the laptop off the desk. "No. No way. You killed that test." Deshaun didn't respond. He sat frozen, staring at the grade like it was a knife in his chest. He opened his backup folder, pulled up the PDF of his own scanned answers. He had copied them page for page. They were brilliant, sharp, impeccable. It didn't make sense, unless it wasn't a mistake. He picked up his phone to call Dr. Nolan, but before he could dial, his email notification pinged. It was a system-generated alert from the faculty server. User log grade adjustment activity. 1 new record. Attached was a time-stamped entry, edited by Profs. B. Allen. Time 3:12 a.m. Action. Grade override. Deshaun Miller. Phil 3. Deshaun's hands slowly covered his mouth. He had proof. They hadn't just tried to fail him. They had done it again. But this time, they left fingerprints. Deshaun stared at the time-stamped grade override for a long, breathless moment. It was raw, unfiltered proof. The screen didn't blink, didn't lie. Professor Benjamin Allen had manually changed his exam grade from an A to a C in the dead silence of night. 3:12 a.m. When no one was watching. When no one was supposed to know. But Allen had made a mistake. He left a digital footprint, a trace buried in the university's outdated internal systems, assuming, as always, that no one would look, and even if they did, no one would dare speak. But this time, Deshaun had come prepared. Every backup folder, every screen recording, every file was logged and time-sealed. And most importantly, he wasn't alone anymore. He called Dr. Nolan immediately. "He did it," Deshaun said as soon as the line connected. "He actually changed it. I have the log file." There was silence on the other end. Then Nolan's voice, low and deliberate. "Then we go forward. No more waiting." By morning, Deshaun had sent the documentation grade records, exam scans, time-stamped server data, to Nolan, who then passed it to an old contact, Elise Grant, an investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing corruption in elite academic institutions. She didn't need convincing. Within hours she responded with 3 words. We're running it. But even that wasn't the biggest shock. Later that same day, a notification buzzed across Deshawn's phone. Northbrook Leaks v3 uploaded to campus server. It was an anonymous post, uploaded to a student-run platform known for hosting class notes and harmless memes. But this time, someone had used it for something much bigger. The leak contained dozens of before and after screenshots, not just of Deshawn's grade, but other students as well, edits spanning years, course logs, internal messages between faculty, including one in which Allen referenced a student as a walking PR trap. Another showed an email where Allen questioned a black female student's capacity for rational argument after she submitted an award-winning essay on racial housing disparities. Deshawn's name was the first one listed. It hit the student body like a thunderclap. Hashtags exploded across platforms. Northbrook Leaks, Justice for Deshawn, Gradegate, Allen must go. Within hours, the screenshots were shared across Twitter, Instagram, even TikTok. A video thread comparing Deshawn's scanned A-grade answers to the C entry became viral overnight. Students, many of whom had once been silent or indifferent, began sharing their own stories. A Latina student described being denied a research opportunity after Allen claimed she lacked academic maturity. A first-generation Asian American senior revealed how her grade dropped after she presented a paper on racialized capitalism. The thread went on and on. The silence had ruptured. Local news stations picked it up by noon. By 3 p.m., vans were parked outside the main gate of the university. Reporters stood with mics in hand, narrating live as students held handmade signs outside the administration building. We are not checkboxes. Academic terrorism is still terrorism. Deshawn deserved better. Protests spread like wildfire. First it was 20 students, then 50. By evening, it was 1,000. Students marched with purpose. They chanted Deshawn's name, not as a symbol of pity, but as a declaration of defiance. This wasn't just about one man's grade. It was about a system that let it happen, covered it up, and smiled while doing it. Faculty windows were plastered with signs. Some professors stood with students. Others remained silent, blinds drawn, waiting for the storm to pass. But it wouldn't, not this time. Inside the administration wing, panic set in. Emails flew. PR statements were drafted, revised, deleted. Legal teams met, behind closed doors. The university's polished image, the diversity brochures, the equity panels, the smiling multicultural photo shoots, was collapsing under the weight of its own hypocrisy. Deshawn, however, stayed away from the chaos. He watched from the 4th floor of the library, flanked by Marcus and Dr. Nolan. Elise Grant had asked him to go public, to speak, but he'd declined at least for now. Let the truth speak first, he said. Then I'll talk. Dr. Nolan tapped a folder on the table. The board meets in 48 hours. They'll want to make a move fast. They'll try to scapegoat Allen, Marcus said bitterly. Pin everything on him. Pretend they had no idea. They won't get away with it, Deshawn said. Not this time. We have records. Years of it. A moment of silence followed, heavy and surreal. None of them expected it to move this fast. None of them expected the university to crack, but the crack was spreading. That night, just after 9 p.m., a breaking email alert was sent to all faculty and students. Subject: Emergency Personnel Update. Message: Effective immediately. Professor Benjamin Allen has been placed on temporary administrative leave pending further investigation into grade inconsistencies and faculty conduct violations. No apology. No admission. Just cold distancing. It should have felt like a win. But to Deshawn, it felt incomplete. He's not done, he murmured, almost to himself. They don't just fold him up and file him away. He's not that type. Marcus frowned. You think he's gonna fight back? Deshawn's jaw tightened. I think he already is. Because even as the protests grew louder, even as news vans circled and alumni began to pull their donations in protest, something about the silence from Allen's side was too perfect, too coordinated. He hadn't spoken, hadn't denied, hadn't shown his face, and that made Deshawn's stomach twist. When he returned to his dorm that night, another surprise was waiting. An envelope slid under the door. Thick. No name, just his. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Careful who you trust. The leak wasn't as anonymous as you think. Attached was a photo of Dr. Nolan, entering a side door of the IT department. Time-stamped, dated, 24 hours before the Northbrook leaks upload. Deshawn stared at it, heart thudding. Was it real? Had Nolan uploaded the leak himself? And if he did, why hadn't he said anything? The photo of Dr. Nolan slipped from Deshawn's fingers and landed face down on the desk. It wasn't just the image itself, it was the implication, timing, intent, trust. Everything he'd relied on for weeks, everything he'd built in secret with Nolan, now trembled under the weight of one printed snapshot. For a long while, Deshawn sat motionless in his dorm chair, the hum of the heater the only sound filling the silence. The idea that the only faculty member who had stood beside him, risked tenure for him, might also be hiding something. It burned deeper than betrayal. It hinted at something worse, manipulation. But he didn't act impulsively. Not this time. He didn't confront Nolan. He didn't text Marcus. Instead, he pulled the photo back toward him, studied it again. The timestamp matched the night before the leak. The door was the tech maintenance entrance, rarely used. But none of that was proof of guilt. It was proof of presence. And for now, that distinction mattered. The next day, Northbrook's campus felt less like a university and more like a live broadcast under siege. National headlines now included words like racism, data breach, academic integrity, and whistleblower retaliation. And at the center of it all, Deshawn Miller. Journalists crowded the sidewalks. Police patrolled nervously, instructed not to interfere unless public safety was at risk. Protesters filled the quad, led by students of every background, some of whom had never even spoken to Deshawn before but now shouted his name through megaphones with conviction. There were signs painted with his face, quotes from his leaked exam, even screenshots of the grade change blown up on cardboard like courtroom exhibits. The campus was no longer controlled by its administration. It belonged for the first time to its students. Still, the university refused to issue a formal apology. Instead, they released a carefully worded statement. Northbrook University acknowledges recent concerns and is taking steps to investigate faculty conduct while reaffirming our commitment to academic equity and student success. To Deshawn, it read like varnished silence, like a shield meant to absorb headlines and redirect accountability. But it didn't work. Not this time. Not when screenshots lived forever. Not when students recorded everything. Not when his inbox was overflowing with messages from students across the country who had lived versions of his same story, erased, silenced, discarded. It was Nolan who came to him with the opportunity. They've announced a live-stream town hall for damage control, he said. It's meant to reassure the community. Deshawn raised a brow. Reassure who? Exactly, Nolan replied. That's why I want you to speak. The platform's open. You have the floor. Deshawn hesitated. Not out of fear. Out of the knowledge that once he spoke, there would be no going back. Speaking in that forum wouldn't just be a protest. It would be an indictment of the institution from inside its own walls. But he agreed. When the day came, the auditorium was packed. Overflow rooms streamed it on screens. Thousands of students, faculty, press, and virtual attendees logged in. University leadership sat stiffly in the front row. Dean Lyle among them, her face unreadable. Deshawn walked to the podium wearing no tie, no suit, no fake performance. Just a hoodie, jeans, and the truth.
I wasn't going to speak today, he began, voice calm, almost quiet.
Because I've been told my whole life that raising your voice gets you labeled angry, difficult, dangerous. But silence, especially in institutions like this, isn't peace. It's erasure. The room stilled. I didn't ask to be the center of a scandal. I asked about an exam fee. I asked why a professor with a history of racist conduct was still grading black students. And for that, I was denied, dismissed, humiliated, and then nearly buried in paperwork designed to look like protocol. He paused, letting the words breathe. But I'm not just here for me. I'm here for every student who's ever swallowed an insult from someone with tenure. For every student who got a B when they wrote like an A. For every black kid who got told they were too emotional in a paper about survival. He pulled out printed copies of the grade log. This is what a mistake looks like when you know no one will check. Then he pulled up screenshots from the leak, displayed on the massive screen behind him. This, he said, pointing, is how racism looks when dressed in academic language. The auditorium was silent, but it wasn't passive. Students leaned forward, eyes locked. Faculty shifted uncomfortably. One administrator whispered to another, but their words were lost under the weight of the screen. Deshawn leaned in closer to the mic. I don't want your sympathy. I want your accountability. I want structural reform. I want transparency. I want independent oversight on grading policies. I want every name Alan downgraded to be contacted, apologized to, and if possible corrected. Applause began. Then cheers. Then justice for Deshaun. Fix the system. No more silence. The live stream comments exploded. Viewers from across the country lit up the chat. Powerful. My school did the same to me. Don't let them bury him. By the end of the speech, donations to a new fund, Justice for Deshaun, had crossed $85,000 in under 2 hours. Alumni began issuing public letters threatening to withhold donations. A former trustee posted on LinkedIn, "I will no longer support Northbrook University until it returns to its core values of truth, equity, and justice." It was not just public backlash, it was public reckoning. And Deshaun had become the face of it. Not by design, but by necessity. That night, Marcus shoved his phone at Deshaun with wide eyes. "Dude, look." An email from Cassandra Price, executive producer of Frontline America, one of the top primetime news programs in the country. Subject line: National Broadcast Request, your story, your voice. The message read, "Deshaun, we've followed the Northbrook story closely. Our audience has too. We'd be honored to have you on our show. Prime time. Full segment. Live audience. Millions watching. Let us know if you're ready." Marcus stared at him. "You realize what this means?" Deshaun nodded slowly, the weight of it crashing down like waves.
Yeah.
"It means we're past campus walls now." He sat on the edge of his bed, the message still open on his screen. And he didn't notice the email right below it, marked urgent from an unknown sender. One line: "You go on that stage, and it's not just your reputation we'll take." The studio lights were hotter than Deshaun expected, bright enough to erase shadows, bright enough to make a person feel exposed in ways they couldn't prepare for. As he sat in the green room waiting to be called, he could hear the muffled hum of the live audience, the countdown beeps from the control booth, and the soft, steady breathing of the makeup artist who had just finished powdering his forehead. She had whispered, "You're brave," before stepping aside, the kind of fragile encouragement offered by someone who understood the risks but couldn't name them. Deshaun didn't reply. His thoughts were fixed on the anonymous warning, still sitting unopened in his mind. "You go on that stage, and it's not just your reputation we'll take." He didn't know who sent it. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew what backing down would cost him. And every student who had been silenced long before he ever stepped onto Northbrook's campus. A stagehand in a headset introduced himself softly, then guided him toward the wing of the studio. Beyond the curtain, Cassandra Price's voice rang out smooth, authoritative, practiced. "Tonight, we speak with a young man whose story has shaken one of America's most prestigious universities. A story about racism, power, and what happens when silence is no longer an option." The audience applauded, but it wasn't the applause of entertainment. It was expectation. They were waiting for truth, for confrontation, for something real in a world that tried so hard to sanitize everything painful. "Please welcome Deshaun Miller." The curtain parted, and he stepped out into a spotlight that swallowed everything else. Cassandra stood to greet him, offering a warm handshake that didn't feel performative. As they sat, the cameras adjusted, swiveling toward them like watchful eyes. Cassandra gave the signal. The red recording light blinked alive, and America tuned in. "Deshaun," Cassandra began, leaning in with a seriousness that felt disarming. "Millions of people have followed your story. But I want to start with the moment everything changed. The moment your professor said the now viral words, 'You'll never afford this exam.' What went through your mind in that exact instant?" For a beat, the world seemed to hold still. Deshaun inhaled slowly, trying to summon not just the memory, but the emotion without breaking beneath it. "I felt small," he said finally. "Like all the work I'd done, everything I fought through to get to that classroom, meant nothing the moment he looked at me. It wasn't about the exam fee, it was about the assumption behind it. That a black student asking about cost must be poor, unprepared, undeserving." Cassandra nodded, her gaze unwavering. "And yet you stayed in that class." "I had to," he said, "because walking out would have proved him right, in everyone else's eyes. Staying was the only way I could reclaim my place." Images of the protests flashed across the screen behind them. Students holding signs chanting his name, demanding action. Cassandra turned toward the camera briefly, then back to him. "When your grade was tampered with, you didn't just call it unfair, you proved it. How did it feel to see your A transformed into a C?" "It wasn't shock," he admitted. "It was recognition. It was confirmation of something I had felt long before the digital proof appeared. That some people in these institutions don't see black excellence as excellence. They see it as a threat. And when they can't discredit your efforts, they rewrite the outcome. A stir moved through the audience. Anger, empathy, disbelief. Cassandra's next question hit deeper. There are people who say these issues are exaggerated, that institutions like Northbrook don't discriminate. What do you say to them? I say they've never lived in a world that required them to prove they belong in every room they enter. He replied. They've never had to shrink themselves to avoid being labeled aggressive. They've never been punished for speaking truth. Racism in academia isn't loud. It isn't violent. It's quiet. It's subtle. It's hiding behind policies and professionalism. And it's deadly to anyone who's trying to climb a ladder that was never built for them. Applause erupted. Cassandra didn't silence it. She let it run its course. Then came the inevitable part, the pushback. Cassandra lifted a stack of printed tweets, headlines, and online posts. Some critics, anonymous accounts, mostly have questioned your academic record, your background, even your intentions. They've implied you're using this for fame or sympathy. Deshawn didn't flinch. People try to tear down what they fear. And institutions fear the truth. So their supporters fear the truth. But I didn't ask for virality. I didn't ask for donations. I didn't ask for national news. I asked for fairness. And when fairness was denied, I asked for accountability. The audience applauded again, louder this time. Then something unexpected happened. Cassandra smiled gently and said, speaking of donations, you've received more than most college students will see in a lifetime. Nearly 6 figures through the Justice for Deshawn Fund. People want to support you. How do you feel about that? He paused, collecting himself. Grateful, he said softly. But money wasn't what I needed. And yet, she added, you haven't spent a single dollar of it, the audience murmured. Cassandra leaned closer. So what do you plan to do with it? This was the moment he hadn't told anyone about. Not Marcus, not Nolan, not even his mother. The decision had come to him quietly, during a rare moment of stillness. It wasn't impulsive. It was clarity. I'm donating it, he said simply. The audience gasped. Cassandra blinked, visibly taken aback. All of it, every cent, he said. There are students right now who are where I was, brilliant, determined, but blocked by fees, policies, and bias. I don't want the money to become a symbol of what I lost. I want it to become a symbol of what others can gain. We're creating a scholarship fund for low-income students of color. No essays, no interviews, no hoops to jump through. If they need the money, they get the money. It was the kind of moment that didn't just shock, it inspired. The audience rose to its feet in a standing ovation. Cassandra watched him with something like awe. You understand this makes your story even bigger than before, she said, her voice quieter now. You're not just exposing injustice, you're rewriting the term. As the segment closed, Cassandra thanked him. The cameras cut, and the studio fell into a sudden hush, one that came only after conversations that mattered. Deshawn shook her hand again, feeling a strange mixture of relief, exhaustion, and something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. But outside the studio, the world hadn't softened. Paparazzi hovered. Cars honked. Protesters chanted his name. For the first time in weeks, Deshawn didn't feel overwhelmed by the noise. It felt like fuel. He walked past the crowd, past the cameras, past the reporters calling his name, and headed straight to the one place where this part of the story needed to end. The bursar's office, with a 6-figure check in his hand. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that someone was already waiting inside. The bursar's office looked different that morning. Not physically, but in the way people stepped aside as Deshawn entered, in the way conversations dimmed as though someone had lowered invisible volume knobs throughout the room. Students waiting for routine transactions turned to stare, recognizing him instantly from the live stream. The protests, the news cycle that had spun his life into national discourse. Standing there with the 6-figure check tucked inside a plain envelope, Deshawn felt the surreal weight of the moment. Not pride, not defiance, but a kind of clarity that came only when life had stripped everything else away. He wasn't here to reclaim what was lost. He was here to build something no one could take from those who came after him. Behind the glass partition, the bursar, Mrs. Halverson, a woman who had always worn a stiff smile and neutral politeness, straightened as he approached. The lines around her eyes tightened with something like nervousness. Miller, she said, her voice softer than usual. How can we assist you today? But she already knew. Everyone knew. The entire campus had braced for whatever he would choose to do next. Without flourish, without theatrics, he slid the envelope under the partition. I'm here to make a donation. he said. $100,000. The bursar blinked, stunned into stillness. When she finally opened the envelope and saw the number printed on the check, her mouth parted slightly, as if she had forgotten how to speak. This is quite generous, she whispered. It's not generosity, Deshawn replied. It's necessity. She looked up slowly, uncertain whether she was witnessing history or controversy. And the name of the fund? This was the part that mattered most to him. He could have named it after himself, after the fight he had endured, after the injustice he had survived. But instead he thought of the nights when the campus pushed him into the margins, when silence became his only companion, when he sat on the cold tile floor of a maintenance closet, lit by the weak glow of a single bulb, studying alone because every study hall and lounge closed before his work shifts ended. He thought of the man who never asked why a black student was studying in a place meant for mops and brooms, never questioned whether he belonged, never once looked at him with pity or suspicion. Name it after Mr. Theodore Blackwell, Deshawn said quietly. The night janitor. The bursar froze, surprised by the name. Mr. Blackwell? The one who helped me, he said, when he didn't have to. In an institution built on prestige, wealth, and hierarchy, Mr. Blackwell had offered something no scholarship had: dignity. He had unlocked the maintenance closet every night without judgment, left the door propped open so the air wouldn't grow too stale, and sometimes slipped a protein bar beside Deshawn's backpack with a simple nod, never asking for thanks. The fund will be called the Blackwell Equity and Education Grant, Deshawn said, for low-income black students. No essays, no interviews, no committees deciding whose struggle is worthy. If they need support, they receive it. A hush fell over the office. Even students who had pretended not to eavesdrop were now openly watching him, their expressions shifting, some moved, some shocked, some humbled by the magnitude of his decision. It wasn't just a donation. It was reclamation. It was rewriting the narrative of who gets remembered at institutions like this. Mrs. Halverson cleared her throat. We will prepare the documentation immediately, she said, but her voice trembled. Mr. Miller, this will mean more than you know. I know exactly what it means, he replied. He left the office with a strange calm settling over him. Not triumph, not relief, but a grounded certainty. He hadn't fought for fame, nor sympathy, nor revenge. He fought so someone else wouldn't have to. So a future student wouldn't hear the words, "You don't belong here," echoing through the places meant to uplift them. Outside, reporters swarmed him like bees drawn to a flare of heat. Microphones thrust forward, questions shouted over one another. Why donate the money? Why name it after a janitor? What does this mean for Northbrook? But he didn't stop. He offered only one succinct answer that rippled through the crowd. Because equity should not be charity. It should be structure. The clip went viral before he even reached the quad. But another headline soon eclipsed even that. By late afternoon, Northbrook University released a statement, not vague, not evasive, but startlingly direct. Effective immediately, Professor Benjamin Allen has been terminated for gross misconduct, academic fraud, and violation of federal educational policies. Students erupted into cheers across the campus. Protesters who had camped outside administration for days hugged each other in disbelief. Some cried. For them, Allen wasn't just a professor. He was the embodiment of everything the institution refused to confront. His fall signaled something larger, the first crack in a wall long thought unbreakable. But it didn't stop there. The Department of Education announced it was opening a federal investigation into Northbrook's discriminatory grading practices and systemic suppression of complaints. Suddenly, the story wasn't confined to campus. It was national. It was structural. It was a case study in modern academic racism. Amid the chaos, Deshawn walked across the green, passing groups of students who looked at him, not with pity or curiosity, but something else. Respect mixed with possibility. He saw freshmen whispering his name with awe, seniors nodding at him with gratitude, faculty members stepping aside, giving him space not out of fear but acknowledgement. As he approached the maintenance building, he saw Mr. Blackwell leaning on his mop handle near the doorway, watching him with gentle confusion. Heard you been busy, the older man said with a chuckle that softened the world around them. His eyes were warm, surprised, touched. They're saying your name on TV. Can't turn a corner without hearing about you. Deshawn smiled. None of this would have happened without you. Mr. Blackwell frowned, shaking his head. All I did was open a door, son, and that's exactly why it mattered. Deshawn said. You opened a door when others closed them. When he told Mr. Blackwell about the fund, about the name, about the future generations who would study in rooms far bigger than closets because of him. The man's eyes filled with tears. He refused to let fall. "Boy," he whispered, voice cracking, "you didn't have to do that." "Yes," Deshaun replied softly. "I did." That night, every major news outlet ran the story. Student who exposed academic racism, donates settlement to fund opportunities for black youth. Civil rights leaders tweeted praise. Celebrities offered additional matching funds. The grant soared past $300,000 before dawn. It should have been the happiest night of his life. But late in the evening, after returning to his dorm, after the noise of celebration faded into the distant hum of campus nightlife, a knock came at his door. Soft, deliberate, intentional. No one stood there when he opened it. Only an envelope. Thick, heavy, stamped with the Northbrook University administrative seal in deep embossed gold. His name written across the front. No return address. No explanation. Something about its weight felt ominous, as if whatever rested inside had been waiting quietly, plotting, while the world cheered outside. Deshaun closed the door slowly, turning the envelope in his hand. The university had already fired Allen, already launched committees, already faced federal scrutiny. So what was left to say? What was left to threaten? His thumb brushed the seam of the envelope. Inside, something waited that would change everything again. For a long time, Deshaun did not open the envelope. He held it the way someone holds a fragile confession. Careful, wary, aware that whatever waited inside could shift the ground beneath him again. After everything he had endured, letters with official seals carried a different weight now. They were no longer simple carriers of news. They were tools, sometimes weapons, sometimes shields, always powerful in the hands of an institution that had once tried to bury him. He placed the envelope on his desk, its gold seal glinting under the dim bedroom lamp, and stared at it, as if waiting for it to reveal its intentions before he dared touch it again. Eventually, with steady breath and deliberate patience, he broke the seal. The envelope opened with a soft tear, exposing thick ivory paper folded neatly inside. His name was printed at the top, not typed, but written in ink. Beneath it, lines of formal text unfurled like a verdict. At first the words seemed too refined, too elegant to be real. He read them once, then again, then a third time, the truth slowly crystallizing with each pass. Northbrook University was offering him a full academic fellowship, a complete financial package to pursue his PhD in educational justice and institutional reform, a newly developed track in their graduate studies division, full tuition, housing provision, a living stipend, and a research grant. The university that had once mocked him, dismissed him, tried to silence him, now extended an invitation that would have been unimaginable months earlier. Not out of generosity, not out of guilt alone, but because the institution had been forced to reckon with itself, and he had become the catalyst they could no longer ignore. The letter was flattering in tone, packed with words like leadership, transformational impact, and commitment to equity. Yet beneath its polished language, Deshaun sensed something more complex. This wasn't just an opportunity, it was a mirror. The university had been cornered, exposed, and pressured into structural change, but they also recognized something in him, something sharp, relentless, and necessary. They weren't offering him a seat at the table as a gesture of peace. They were offering it because they finally understood he knew how to build new tables entirely. The next morning, he walked across campus with the envelope tucked under his arm. The winter air was crisp, brushing against his face as though urging him forward, reminding him that every step taken here carried history. Students waved at him, some approached shyly, others boldly, thanking him for showing what's possible, for making a scene, for standing up when no one else could. He listened to each of them with quiet humility. Their voices reminded him why he had fought, not for recognition, not for revenge, but for the dozens of unheard voices that trembled under the weight of quiet oppression. He stopped for a moment near the old building, where the insult had first been thrown at him. He could still picture it, the way the students looked at him with pity, the way Professor Allen smirked as if daring the room to challenge him, the humiliation that burned like a stain on his skin. But now, standing in the same hallway months later, the space felt different, not healed, not redeemed, but reclaimed. Deshaun realized that survival wasn't just about getting through something. It was about returning to the place where you were broken and refusing to let the memory define you. Later that week, the university held a formal announcement ceremony to introduce the new educational justice program. Reporters attended. Students filled the seats, and faculty members who once walked past Deshawn without acknowledgement now studied him with a mixture of unease and admiration. Nolan stood alongside him, not as a savior, not as a symbol, but as an ally whose quiet persistence had been as vital as Deshawn's courage. Despite the lingering question of the photograph slipped under his door weeks earlier, Deshawn no longer felt suspicion toward him. He understood now that movements were never clean, never perfect, and sometimes even allies had to choose complicated paths to ignite change. The ceremony unfolded, with all the formalities expected of academia, but when Deshawn was invited to speak, the room grew still. He walked to the podium, aware of how different this moment felt compared to the town hall. That time he had spoken for survival. This time he spoke for the future. When I came to Northbrook, he began, I came with the belief that education was the great equalizer. That knowledge could shield a person from bias, from assumption, from harm. But institutions are not equalizers. People are. People willing to disrupt what's comfortable. People willing to tell the truth even when the truth cost them. People willing to open doors when others close them. His eyes drifted toward the back of the room, where Mr. Blackwell stood in his Navy uniform, trying to remain unnoticed. This journey was not shaped by the ones who held power, he continued, but by the ones who shared humanity. As he spoke of structural change, accountability, and resilience, many audience members found themselves unexpectedly emotional. It wasn't the rhetoric, it was the authenticity of his voice, measured, weary, yet overflowing with purpose. He wasn't preaching. He wasn't inspiring for applause. He was naming what the institution had taught him in its failure. That transformation required both fire and clarity. After the ceremony, Deshawn walked back across the quad alone, savoring the stillness. Students called out to him, some asking for advice, some thanking him as though he had personally lifted burdens from their lives. One girl hugged him without explanation before rushing away in tears. Another student, wearing a backpack too heavy for his frame, told him, "You made me feel like I can survive here too." Those moments mattered more to Deshawn than any fellowship letter. But the true full-circle moment came days later, when he stood in the graduate wing, signing the fellowship acceptance papers. It felt surreal. The same institution that once forced him to justify his existence now asked him to lead the conversation on systemic reform. He imagined the younger version of himself, hungry, exhausted, frightened, studying under the hum of a maintenance closet light, and wished he could whisper into that moment, "You will not just survive this place, you will reshape it." That afternoon, as he prepared to leave campus grounds for the weekend, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see a freshman, black, thin, anxious, clutching a stack of textbooks like a shield. Her voice trembled, not from fear but from vulnerability. "Excuse me," she said softly. I don't mean to bother you. I've seen what you went through, what you did, and I haven't been here long, but it already feels heavy. Like I'm supposed to shrink myself. Like I'm already behind before I start. So, I guess my question is," she swallowed hard, "how did you survive here?" The world seemed to pause once more. Her question wasn't admiration. It was plea, not for comfort, but for strategy. It was the same question he once asked himself, during nights when the institution felt like a maze designed to break him. A question that carried fear and hope intertwined, and as he opened his mouth to answer, knowing the truth would be raw, imperfect, and necessary, the wind shifted, carrying the sound of distant voices, footsteps and the echoes of a campus still in the throes of transformation. Before he could respond, another voice called his name from behind, urgent, breathless, disruptive. He turned, startled. A staff member rushed toward him, holding yet another sealed envelope. This one marked confidential, immediate action required. "Mr. Miller," she said, panting slightly. "You need to see this, right now." Deshawn looked from the envelope to the freshman, then back again. Whatever was inside this time was not a fellowship, not recognition, not praise. Something new, something unsettling, had arrived. If this story moved you, type yes in the comments. And tell us, have you ever seen someone underestimated just because of where they come from? Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that expose the quiet battles behind everyday injustice. Because every voice that speaks out brings us one step closer to a system that finally listens.